In the early 1930s, the United States was in crisis. Prohibition had criminalized alcohol, but it had also created something far more powerful: organized crime. Across major cities, criminal syndicates replaced law enforcement as the true authority. New York City was the center of that power, and within New York, Harlem stood at the heart of a silent war. Harlem was not just a neighborhood, it was an economic engine, a cultural center, and a criminal stronghold. Illegal gambling, numbers rackets, protection money, and underground businesses generated millions of dollars. Whoever controlled Harlem controlled influence far beyond its streets. And by the early 1930s, that control belonged to one man: Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was not a typical crime boss. He avoided public attention. He avoided unnecessary violence. He relied on intelligence, structure, and long-term planning. Law enforcement found him difficult to prosecute. Rival gangs found him difficult to reach. In Harlem, Bumpy Johnson was not just feared, he was respected. Across the city, another figure was rising: Dutch Schultz. Where Johnson was controlled, Schultz was volatile. Where Johnson planned, Schultz reacted. Schultz built his empire through intimidation, extreme violence, and unpredictability. His reputation made even other crime bosses uneasy, and eventually his ambition brought him into conflict with Harlem. At first, the conflict was indirect. Territories overlapped, business routes interfered, profits declined. Schultz believed Harlem should fall under his influence. Johnson disagreed. Neither man was willing to retreat. Attempts at negotiation failed. Smaller confrontations followed. Messages were sent. Warnings were ignored. To Schultz, Johnson's continued survival represented defiance, and Schultz did not tolerate defiance. By late 1933, Schultz reached a conclusion. Bumpy Johnson had to be eliminated, not intimidated, not negotiated with, removed. This was not an emotional decision, it was strategic, or so Schultz believed. Schultz did not rely on a single assassin. He selected 12 men, experienced, reliable, proven. Each man had carried out violent operations before. The plan relied on numbers, speed, and surprise. Johnson would be overwhelmed. At least, that was the theory. The 12 men entered Harlem separately. They avoided drawing attention. They observed routines. They memorized routes. They positioned themselves carefully. Everything appeared to be under control, but Harlem noticed. Accounts suggest Johnson was alerted before the attack began. How remains unknown. Possibilities include informants, intercepted communication, or instinct developed through experience. Regardless of the source, Johnson understood the danger, and he responded methodically. Johnson adjusted his environment. Entrances were secured, lighting was controlled, trusted associates were positioned strategically. This was not a desperate defense, it was an organized countermeasure. The first attacker approached. There was no confusion, no hesitation. He was neutralized immediately. The element of surprise vanished. The operation began to unravel. The remaining men reacted independently. Communication broke down. Gunfire echoed in enclosed spaces. Visibility was limited. The attackers could not identify their opponents. One by one, Schultz's men were eliminated. What was designed as a coordinated strike turned chaotic. Some men attempted to regroup. Others attempted to retreat. Both options failed. Johnson's defense anticipated movement. Those still alive began to understand the truth. This was not a miscalculation. This was preparation. They had entered a controlled environment where every advantage worked against them. Johnson eventually revealed himself. Witness accounts describe no urgency, no emotional display, only control. The encounter was brief. There was nothing left to negotiate. Attempts to flee failed. Weapons malfunctioned or were abandoned. Within minutes, the operation ended. All 12 attackers were gone. Morning arrived quietly. Police investigations followed familiar patterns. Limited cooperation, few witnesses, no clear suspects. Johnson remained untouched. When Schultz learned the outcome, the impact was immediate. 12 men lost. No result. It was a complete operational failure. For the first time, Schultz faced the limits of violence. After this incident, Schultz's influence weakened. Johnson's reputation strengthened. Other crime figures took notice. Power dynamics shifted. Harlem remained under Johnson's control. The incident became part of New York's criminal history. It demonstrated that power did not depend solely on force. Preparation, intelligence, and control could defeat overwhelming numbers. Bumpy Johnson survived one of the most aggressive assassination attempts of the era. Dutch Schultz learned a costly lesson. In the underworld of New York, not every war is won by the strongest force. Sometimes survival itself defines victory.
The echo of the 12 guns had not yet faded when Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson sat in the back room of his favorite Harlem restaurant, the air still thick with the ghosts of cordite and fear. A single glass of now legal whiskey sat untouched before him. The victory was absolute, but his mind, a strategist's mind, was already 5 moves ahead. Dutch Schultz was a wounded animal, and wounded animals were at their most dangerous. They thrash, they lash out blindly. Bumpy's defense had been perfect, but perfection was a one-time event. Schultz would not make the same mistake twice. His next move would be unthinkable. Across town, in a fortress-like suite at the Brewster Hotel, Dutch Schultz was doing exactly that. The volatile gangster was not weeping over his lost men. He was vibrating with a rage so pure it was ice-cold. The numbers enraged him. 12-1. The odds were laughable, obscene, and yet Harlem had swallowed his best men whole. It wasn't a defeat, it was an impossibility, and the impossibility had a name: Bumpy Johnson. "He's not human," Schultz muttered to his last loyal lieutenant, a wiry man named Lulu. "He's a ghost in his own damn kingdom." But Schultz's logic was perversely sound. If you cannot kill the king, you must make the kingdom itself revolt. If you cannot reach Bumpy through force, you must unravel the world that protected him. His new plan was not strategic, it was pathological. He would burn Harlem down, not with fire, but with poison. The first sign was subtle. A popular numbers banker, a man who'd paid his dues to Bumpy's organization for a decade, was found floating in the Harlem River. His ledgers were missing. This was not unusual in and of itself, tragic but not unusual. The second sign was economic. 2 of the most profitable underground casinos, operating with Johnson's silent protection, were simultaneously raided by a surprisingly efficient and well-informed squadron of NYPD officers. The managers were arrested. The cash reserves vanished into evidence lockers. The tip-offs, which Bumpy's network had always relied on, had never come. The third sign was cultural, and it cut the deepest. The Renaissance Casino, a hub of music, dance, and community, where Bumpy was a revered shadow, received a visit from men in sharp suits. They were not Italians from Schultz's usual crew. They were new faces, speaking with clipped, unfamiliar accents. They made an offer to the owner. "Sell the entertainment contract to us. Our bands will play. Our liquor will flow. A percentage goes to Mr. Schultz. Refuse, and the great Duke Ellington might find his piano mysteriously out of tune, permanently." The threat was against the soul of Harlem itself. Bumpy, monitoring these events from his web of informants, understood the shift immediately. Schultz was no longer attacking the body, he was attacking the nervous system. He was targeting the trust, the economy, and the culture that Bumpy not only exploited, but, in his own complex way, stewarded. Schultz was trying to turn Harlem's loyalty from an asset into a liability. "He's making it expensive to protect me," Bumpy said quietly to his most trusted advisor, a woman named Madame St. Clair, who ran the neighborhood's most prestigious numbers operation. They sat in the same back room, the untouched whiskey now joined by a pot of strong coffee. "The people are nervous, Bumpy," she said, her voice low. "They feel the ground shifting. Respect keeps the peace, but fear of a Dutch Schultz reign, that makes people desperate. Desperate people look for new saviors, or they make foolish deals." Bumpy nodded. Defense was no longer enough. He had to demonstrate that his control was not just reactive, but omnipresent. He had to show that Schultz's poison could be antidoted, and that the source of the poison could be reached, even from Harlem. He began a campaign of exquisite, targeted pressure. The following week, a shipment of Schultz's finest Canadian whiskey, destined for his speakeasies in the Bronx, was hijacked not by force, but by paperwork. The truck drivers, after a friendly conversation with some of Bumpy's associates, simply drove the entire convoy to a warehouse in Jersey, owned by a shell corporation Bumpy controlled. The bills of lading had been perfectly forged. To the outside world, the shipment had vanished into thin air. Simultaneously, Schultz's most reliable money launderer, a fussy accountant named Goldblatt with an office in Midtown, received a package. It contained not a threat, but a gift, a detailed, leather-bound ledger. When Goldblatt opened it, he found a perfect replica of his own secret books, detailing every dollar washed for Schultz over the past 2 years. A single, crisp note was paper-clipped to the first page. "A copy resides with my friend at the New York Times. The next edition is blank."
The message was clear. Johnson's intelligence network could reach into Schultz's very pockets and his bookkeeper's office. The brute who sent 12 killers could be outmaneuvered in the light of day. But Schultz, cornered, escalated. His rage needed a physical outlet. If he couldn't hit Bumpy, he would hit his heart. He targeted the one person in Harlem whose harm would be a blow to both the community and, Schultz suspected, to Bumpy's carefully guarded humanity. Sister Mary Margaret, the aging nun who ran the St. Catherine's soup kitchen. She fed the poor, gave counsel to the lost, and had, 20 years prior, given a skinny, angry young boy named Ellsworth Johnson a bowl of stew and a word of kindness that had, in some small way, altered his trajectory. Her safety was the neighborhood's unwritten law. 2 of Schultz's thugs, low-level and disposable, were sent to the kitchen with a simple task: wreck it, terrify the nun, make a mess that screamed Schultz was here. They never laid a hand on a single pot. As they kicked open the service door, they were met not by screaming volunteers, but by silence, and by the imposing figures of 3 men who stood waiting in the gloom of the pantry. These were not Bumpy's usual elegant lieutenants. These were the bag men, specialists from the deep corners of Harlem, rarely seen but often whispered about. They were quiet, immense, and carried not guns, but heavy canvas sacks and lengths of lead pipe. There was no gunfire to draw police, no dramatic speeches, just the sickening, muffled thuds of impact, the grunt of expelled air, and the quiet, efficient rustle of canvas. In under 3 minutes, the 2 thugs were gone, vanished into the sacks, destined for anonymous drop in the East River. The kitchen was spotless. Sister Mary Margaret, who had watched the entire event with a stern, unflinching gaze, simply crossed herself and went back to peeling potatoes. When word of this reached Schultz, the complete, silent disappearance of his men at a soup kitchen, a new kind of fear finally pierced his fury. It wasn't the fear of a rival, but the fear of the uncanny. Johnson's authority wasn't just about guns and money, it was woven into the very brick and mortar of Harlem. The streets themselves fought for him. The church basements hid his soldiers. The silence of the poor protected him. The war reached its stalemate not with a bang, but with a shuddering, exhausted sigh. Schultz, his finances suddenly under scrutiny, his supply lines fragile, and his own men growing superstitious about entering Harlem, found his attention forcibly shifted. The federal government, spurred by whispers of his tax evasion, whispers that originated from a certain ledger copy, was closing in. He had a bigger, more official enemy to fight. One crisp autumn evening, a lone, unmarked car pulled up to the curb on 135th Street. Out stepped Lulu, Schultz's lieutenant, his face pale. He was escorted to Bumpy's table. He carried no weapon, only a sealed envelope. "From Dutch," Lulu said, the words ash in his mouth. Bumpy took the envelope, slid it open with a pearl-handled letter opener. The message inside was short, written in Schultz's erratic scrawl. It contained no apology, no admission of defeat. It was a single, stark line of truce, a geographic boundary drawn down Fifth Avenue, a concession. Bumpy read it, then held the paper over the flame of a candle on the table. It curled, blackened, and vanished. "Tell Mr. Schultz," Bumpy said, his voice a low rumble, never looking up at the messenger, "that Harlem does not forgive. It forgets, but only if left alone." Lulu left, walking quickly back into the night, forever leaving a piece of his courage in that room. Bumpy finally lifted the glass of whiskey he had left untouched since the night of the 12. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The victory was different this time. It wasn't the sharp, clean triumph of survival against overwhelming force. It was a deeper, more enduring victory of ecosystem over invasion. He had proven that his power was not a fortress to be stormed, but a climate. You could not shoot the weather. You could only endure it or flee. The silent war was over. Dutch Schultz would meet his bloody end not long after, gunned down in a New Jersey chop house by more conventional rivals. But in Harlem, the lesson was etched into the streets. Bumpy Johnson was not just a man who could win a battle. He was the living, breathing manifestation of a neighborhood's will to remain itself. And that was a power no outside force could ever truly eliminate.